Left beside her dead mother on the trail, the young girl wept. A lone cowboy found her, and the brittle pieces of his own shattered past echoed in the tiny, desolate sobs that the wind tried to steal. The sun, a merciless eye in the vast, indifferent sky, beat down upon the parched earth, baking the blood that stained the calico of the woman's dress and the child's tear-streaked face. He'd seen death before, courted it even, in the hollows of his heart where memory festered. But this small, abandoned life, barely bloomed and already blighted, struck a chord so deep within him it was almost physical pain, a phantom limb aching for a lost warmth. Caleb dismounted, his movement stiff, mirroring the rigidity that had claimed his soul years ago. Dust puffed around his worn boots, settling like a shroud. The girl, no more than 8 summers, perhaps 9, flinched but did not look up, her small hand still clutching her mother's cold fingers. He saw the tracks, the single wagon, overloaded, moving west. They hadn't even bothered to bury her. His jaw tightened, a hard line in a face already weathered by sun and sorrow. What kind of world was this, that cast off its young with such cruel indifference? The silence stretched, broken only by the keening of the wind through sparse, skeletal bushes and the girl's ragged breaths. He knelt, slowly, so as not to startle her further. His shadow fell over her, a dark wing of protection she did not yet recognize. He said nothing. Words were stones in his mouth, heavy and useless. He remembered another small hand, another trail, another loss that had scraped him raw and left him empty. The memory was a raw, gaping wound, one he perpetually prodded. He reached out, not to her, but to the canteen on his saddle. He uncorked it, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound stillness. He offered it. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, finally flickered towards him, wide with a terror that knew no words, only experience. She did not take the water. He understood. Why trade one fear for another? He was a stranger, a silhouette against the harsh light, carrying the scent of dust and something else, something akin to the lonely cry of a wolf. He withdrew the canteen, took a slow sip himself, then set it gently on the ground near her, within reach but not imposing. He turned his attention to the mother, his gaze lingering on the peaceful, almost surprised expression frozen on her face. A quick sickness, perhaps. Or heartbreak. The trail was a harsh mistress. He had a shovel tied to his pack. It would be a shallow grave, but it would be something. More than she'd been given by those who left her. He rose, fetched the shovel. The scraping of metal against rock and dry earth was the only sound for a long time. The girl watched, her weeping subsided into a string of hitched breaths. Did she understand this grim courtesy? Or did she simply wait for him to leave her too? He did not know. He did not ask. He just dug, the rhythm a familiar solace, the burn in his shoulders a welcome distraction from the burn in his chest. When it was done, he gently lifted the woman, her body surprisingly light, and laid her in the earth. He said no prayer. He had none left for God or man. He only had the ache, the emptiness, and now, this child. He filled the grave, packed the earth, found a few stones to mark it. Then he looked at the girl. She was still there, a small, stubborn weed clinging to life. He gestured with his head towards his horse. "Come," he said, the word rusty, foreign. She stared, uncomprehending, or perhaps unwilling. He sighed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across barren ground. He would not force her. But he would not leave her. He had claimed her grief, and with it a sliver of her future he was not yet ready to acknowledge. He waited. The sun began its slow descent, painting the desolate landscape in hues of blood orange and bruised purple. The air grew cooler, carrying the first chill whispers of the coming night. Still, the girl did not move, a tiny effigy of sorrow. Caleb walked to his horse, rummaged in his saddlebag, and pulled out a piece of jerky and a slightly bruised apple he'd been saving. He approached her again, laid them beside the canteen. "Eat," he rasped, the command softened by a weariness that went bone deep. He retreated to a short distance, sat on a rock, and watched the horizon, giving her space, a commodity he knew the value of. He thought of Sarah, of little Eli. The memories, usually sharp-edged and agonizing, were somehow muted today, blurred by the stark reality of this new, raw grief before him. Was this a test? A penance? Or just the random cruelty of the wilderness that had already taken so much from him? He didn't know the answers, and had long ago stopped asking the questions. The sky darkened further, stars beginning to prick the velvet expanse. Coyotes yipped in the distance, their calls mournful and wild, echoing the desolation in his own heart. Finally, a small movement. The girl's hand, tentative as a fawn's first step, reached for the apple. Her small teeth bit into it, the crunch barely audible. Then the jerky. She ate slowly, methodically, her eyes never leaving him. He was a predator, perhaps, but for now, he offered sustenance, not threat. When she was done, she licked her fingers, her gaze still wary, but the sharpest edges of her terror seemed to have dulled. He rose, walked to his horse, and unstrapped his bedroll. He spread it a little way from the new grave, then gestured for her to take it. He would sit watch. She hesitated, then, with an instinct older than words, crawled onto the rough wool, curling into a tight ball, facing away from him, towards the mound of earth that held her mother. He saw her small shoulders shake, but no sound escaped her. Silence was her shield, as it was his. He built a small fire, more for the illusion of comfort than for warmth, the night air still mild. The flames danced, casting flickering shadows, making the familiar shapes of the desert strange and menacing. His cabin was a 2-day ride from here, if he pushed it. A lonely, stark place, built with his own hands, a fortress against the world, and against himself. Could he bring her there? What would he do with a child, a silent, wounded little bird? The thought was a burden, yet, perversely, it was also the first thing that had felt like purpose in years. He watched her until her breathing evened out, until the small, shuddering gasps ceased. He thought of the cradle he'd carved, the one that now sat empty in the corner of his cabin, gathering dust and cobwebs and bitter memories. He had tried to burn it once, but couldn't. It was all that was left of Eli. Now, this girl, Ilara, he decided to call her, for the light in her eyes he had glimpsed for a fleeting second, the light of a distant star. He would take her. Not for her sake, he told himself, but for his. A penance. A distraction. A reason to face the dawn. He didn't know what he would offer her, beyond the meager shelter of his roof and the scant comfort of his presence. But he would not leave her to the coyotes and the wind. He owed that much to the ghosts that haunted him. The journey to his cabin was a silent passage through a landscape that mirrored the desolation in both their hearts. Ilara, as he now thought of her, rode before him on his aging mare, her small back straight, her hands clutching the pommel, a tiny, stoic figure against the vast, unforgiving canvas of the plains. He kept a steadying arm around her, a contact that felt foreign and yet strangely grounding. She did not lean into him, nor did she pull away. She simply endured, a small, resilient plant weathering a storm. They spoke little. Occasionally, he would point. Water, he'd grunt, gesturing to a hidden spring. Or shelter, indicating an overhang of rock where they would rest during the brutal midday sun. She would nod, her eyes absorbing everything, her face unreadable. He wondered what she saw when she looked at him, this rough, silent man who had pulled her from the edge of oblivion. Did she see a savior? A captor? Or just another turn in a life already too harsh for one so young? He could not fathom her thoughts, for her silence was a deeper well than his own. His cabin, when it finally came into view, was little more than a smudge against the foothills, a dark shape hunched beneath the brooding pines. It was a place of solitude, not solace. Built of rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud and determination, it offered little welcome. Smoke curled thinly from the stone chimney, a solitary signal of life in a wilderness that preferred its secrets kept. As they approached, a wolfhound, old and grey-muzzled like its master, rose stiffly from the porch, a low rumble in its chest. "Easy, Fang," Caleb said, his voice softer than Ilara had yet heard it. The dog's tail gave a reluctant thump. Ilara watched the interaction, her gaze intense. He slid from the mare, then gently lifted Ilara down. Her legs were unsteady, and she swayed for a moment before finding her balance. He led her inside. The cabin was dark, smelling of wood smoke, old leather, and a faint, lingering scent of pine. A single room, sparsely furnished. A stone hearth, cold now. A rough table and 2 stools. A cot in one corner, his own. And in another, draped with a dusty canvas, an object whose shape pricked at his memory, a shape he avoided looking at. He motioned for her to sit on one of the stools while he coaxed the embers in the hearth back to life. Fire, the heart of any dwelling, the primal source of warmth and light. He worked with an economy of motion, his hands sure and practiced. Soon, flames licked at the kindling, casting a warm, flickering glow that pushed back the shadows and, perhaps, a fraction of the chill that clung to the girl. He prepared a simple meal, rabbit stew, reheated from the night before, and a piece of coarse bread. He set a bowl before her. Each she picked at it, her movement slow, deliberate. He ate standing by the hearth, his back to her, watching the flames. The silence in the cabin was thick, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the quiet sounds of Ilara eating. When she was finished, she pushed the bowl away. Her eyes, large and dark in the firelight, met his. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible, like the rustle of dry leaves. It was the first she had spoken beyond necessity since he'd found her. The sound startled him. He merely nodded, unsure how to respond to such a fragile offering. He cleared the bowls, then gestured to his cot. Sleep, he would take the floor. She looked at the cot, then at him, a question in her eyes. He understood. Where would he sleep? He pointed to a pile of furs near the hearth. She nodded slowly, then, with a weariness that seemed too profound for her small frame, climbed onto the cot and curled up, facing the wall. He watched her for a long time, the firelight playing over her still form. A small, carved bird lay on the floor near where her hand rested, something she must have clutched during the ride, unseen by him. What burdens did she carry in her silent heart? He banked the fire, the cabin sinking into a deeper gloom. The wind sighed around the eaves, a mournful song. He lay down on the furs, the floor hard beneath him, but it was a familiar discomfort. Sleep was a long time coming, filled with shadows and the echo of a child's sob he could not quite place, hers or another's, lost to time. Days bled into weeks, then into the slow turning of a season. The harsh sun of late summer softened into the golden melancholy of autumn. The aspens in the high country turned a brilliant, trembling yellow, their leaves like scattered coins against the deep blue sky. Caleb fell back into the rhythm of his solitary life, yet it was irrevocably altered by the small, silent presence in his cabin. Ilara was a shadow, quiet and watchful. She moved with a grace that belied the hardships she must have known, her small feet making little sound on the rough plank floor. She did not demand. She did not complain. She simply existed, a fragile bloom in his barren world. He taught her, through action rather than words, how to check the snares he set for rabbits and grouse. How to identify edible roots and berries in the sparse woods around the cabin. Which mushrooms were safe, and which brought a swift, silent death. She learned quickly, her eyes missing nothing, her small hands surprisingly deft. He would leave a task half done, a pile of kindling needing to be stacked, a bucket to be filled at the creek, and return to find it completed, with no acknowledgement sought or given. Her silence was a mirror to his own, yet in hers, he sensed not emptiness, but a deep, observant waiting. Sometimes, he would find her sitting by the creek, her gaze fixed on the water, or watching a hawk circle overhead, her face still and unreadable. Did she dream of her mother? Of the life that had been snatched away? He never asked. He did not know how to breach the wall of her quiet sorrow without shattering them both. His own grief was a familiar companion, a cloak he wore day and night. But hers, so fresh, so raw, felt like a fragile thing he might break with a clumsy word. He found himself carving wood again in the evenings, something he hadn't done since Eli, since before. Small animals, a deer, a wolf, a bird with outstretched wings. He would leave them on the table, and in the morning, they would be gone, spirited away to her corner of the cabin, arranged carefully on a piece of sacking beside the cot. He never saw her take them. It was a silent exchange, a language spoken without sound. One evening, as a chill wind rattled the shutters, presaging the coming winter, he found her staring at the locked chest in the corner, the one draped with the canvas. Her small hand was outstretched, almost touching it. He froze in the doorway, a sudden, cold dread gripping him. That chest held the remnants of Sarah and Eli, a faded dress, a child's worn shoe, a lock of golden hair. Relics of a life he had failed to protect. "Don't," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. She snatched her hand back as if burned, her eyes wide with a familiar fear he hated seeing there. Guilt gnawed at him. He had not meant to frighten her, only to protect himself from the pain that chest represented. He sighed, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "It's nothing," he muttered, turning away, unable to meet her gaze. But it wasn't nothing. It was everything he had lost. And she, in her innocent curiosity, had stumbled upon the rawest edge of his wound. Later that night, as the fire burned low, he heard a sound, a soft, hesitant humming. A melody he almost recognized, a lullaby perhaps, faint and fragile as a moth's wing. He lay on his furs, feigning sleep, his heart aching with a bittersweet pain. Was it a song her mother had sung? Or something conjured from the depths of her own lonely spirit? He did not know. But in that small, uncertain sound, he heard not just sorrow, but a flicker of resilience, a spark of life that refused to be extinguished. The winter, he knew, would be hard. But perhaps, just perhaps, they would weather it together. The first snows came early that year, a soft, insidious blanket that quickly thickened, isolating the small cabin from the rest-off world. The wind, no longer a sigh but a roar, clawed at the logs, searching for entry, its voice a hungry wolf's howl. Inside, the fire in the hearth became the center of their small universe, a defiant heart beating against the encroaching cold. Caleb chopped wood with a grim determination, the rhythmic thud of his axe the only sound to break the oppressive silence of the snow-laden forest. Ilara, wrapped in a too large wool shirt of his, would watch him from the cabin window, her breath fogging the glass. The forced proximity began to fray the edges of Caleb's carefully constructed composure. Her quiet presence was a constant reminder of all he had lost, and all he now, inexplicably, had to protect. One evening, the blizzard reached its peak. Snow swirled in a blinding white fury, erasing the landscape, making the world outside the cabin a formless, terrifying void. The temperature plummeted. Despite the roaring fire, a bitter chill seeped through the chinks in the logs. Ilara began to cough, a dry, rasping sound that tore at Caleb's nerves. He felt her forehead. It was hot, too hot. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through his numbness. He remembered another fever, another child, another storm. The memories, always lurking beneath the surface, surged forth with a brutal intensity. He saw Sarah's pale face, her hand clutching his, her voice weak. He saw Eli, small and still, the light fading from his eyes. He had been helpless then, a storm just like this one trapping them, miles from any aid. He had failed them. The guilt was a suffocating weight. "Water," Ilara whispered, her voice hoarse. He brought her some, his hand trembling as he held the cup to her lips. She sipped, then coughed again, a racking sound that shook her small frame. He piled more wood on the fire, paced the small cabin like a caged animal. The wind shrieked, mocking him. He had to do something. He couldn't lose another. He rummaged through his meager supplies, finding some dried willow bark. He remembered his grandmother using it for fevers. He brewed a bitter tea, coaxing Ilara to drink it. She whimpered, but obeyed, her trust in him absolute, and that trust was a heavier burden than any he had ever carried. As the night wore on, her fever climbed. She tossed and turned on the cot, muttering deliriously. Words he couldn't understand, fragments of a past he didn't know. He sat beside her, wiping her brow with a damp cloth, his heart a cold stone in his chest. The silence, usually his refuge, now felt accusatory. "Sarah," he whispered, the name a painful exhalation. He hadn't spoken it aloud in years. He looked at Ilara, her face flushed, her breathing shallow. "I couldn't save them," he said, the words torn from him, raw and bleeding. "My wife, my boy." He wasn't sure if Ilara could hear him, or if he was just confessing to the storm, to the ghosts that crowded the small cabin. There was a sickness, and a blizzard, just like this. "We were trapped," his voice broke. He buried his face in his hands, the carefully constructed walls around his heart crumbling into dust. The grief, so long suppressed, overwhelmed him, a tidal wave of pain and regret. He felt a small, hot hand touch his arm. He looked up. Ilara's eyes were open, cloudy with fever, but there was a flicker of awareness in them. She said nothing. She just looked at him, her gaze holding a profound, unspoken understanding. Her small fingers tightened on his arm, a fragile anchor in the storm of his despair. He clung to that small touch as if it were a lifeline. The wind howled, the fire crackled, and in the heart of the storm, two broken souls found a fragile, shared moment of humanity. How had she known? How had this child, who had lost so much herself, found the strength to offer comfort to him? He did not know. He only knew that in that moment, something shifted within him, a thawing of the ice that had encased his heart for so long. The storm raged for 3 days and 3 nights, a relentless siege. Caleb tended to Ilara, his earlier panic giving way to a grim, focused resolve. He forced broth and the willow bark tea down her throat, bathed her fevered skin, and spoke to her, not in coherent sentences, but in low murmurs, fragments of stories about the woods, about animals, about stars, anything to fill the terrifying silence of her delirium, anything to tether her to the world of the living. He talked about Sarah's garden, the bright red poppies she loved, about Eli's laughter as he chased butterflies. He spoke of his own failures, his voice raw with unshed tears, confessing his deepest fears to the unconscious child. He didn't know if she heard, but the telling was a purging, a lancing of a wound that had festered for too long. On the 4th morning, the wind finally died. A profound, almost shocking silence descended, broken only by the drip of melting snow from the eaves. The sun rose into a sky scrubbed clean, dazzlingly bright on the pristine white landscape. Caleb, exhausted but alert, watched Ilara. Her breathing was easier, her skin cooler. She stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. Her eyes, clear now, though shadowed with weakness, focused on his face. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice raspy but her own. Relief, so potent it was almost painful, washed over him. He managed a weak smile, the muscles of his face stiff from disuse. "You're back," he said, his own voice hoarse. She nodded, a small, tired movement. "The storm, is it gone?" "Gone," he confirmed, looking out the small, frost-etched window at the transformed world. The cabin, once a prison, now felt like a sanctuary. The shared ordeal had forged a bond between them, stronger than words, deeper than shared grief. It was a bond of survival, of mutual dependence, of a quiet, unspoken understanding. In the days that followed, as Ilara slowly regained her strength, a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere of the cabin. The silence was still there, but it was different now, less a barrier and more a shared space, comfortable and unthreatening. He found himself talking more, not much, but enough. He told her the names of the constellations he could see from their small window, showed her how to track a snowshoe hare by its prints in the fresh snow. She, in turn, began to emerge from her shell. A shy smile would sometimes touch her lips. She started to hum her quiet tunes more often, no longer hesitant. One afternoon, she found the small, carved bird he had made weeks ago, tucked away in her things. She brought it to him, held it out. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice soft but clear. He felt a warmth spread through his chest, an unfamiliar sensation. "For you," he mumbled, embarrassed by the unexpected pleasure her words brought him. She clutched it to her chest, her eyes shining. The locked chest in the corner still sat there, a silent sentinel of his past. But now, it seemed less menacing. The ghosts were still there, but they no longer held him captive. Perhaps, he thought, it was possible to honor the dead without being buried with them. Spring eventually returned, hesitant at first, then with a rush of green. The snow melted, the creek swelled, and the birds returned, their songs filling the air. Life, stubborn and resilient, reasserted itself. Caleb taught Ilara how to plant a small garden, a patch of earth near the cabin where they could grow vegetables. As they worked side by side, turning the soil, planting the seeds, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. This was not the life he had envisioned, not the family he had lost. But it was a life. It was a new beginning, fragile and uncertain, but a beginning nonetheless. He looked at Ilara, her face smudged with dirt, a small smile playing on her lips as she carefully placed a seed in the earth. He saw not just a rescued child, but a companion, a reason. A quiet joy. The seasons turned, each one etching itself onto the landscape and into the rhythms of their shared existence. The small garden flourished under Ilara's surprisingly adept care, its greens and reds a vibrant splash of life against the muted tones of the wilderness. Caleb taught her to read from an old, worn Bible he'd kept, not for its scripture, which he'd long since abandoned, but for the stories, for the cadence of the words. Her voice, at first a hesitant whisper, grew stronger, clearer, as she sounded out the ancient tales. She learned to mend his clothes with neat, small stitches, her brow furrowed in concentration. He, in turn, showed her how to set a clean trap, how to read the signs of the forest, how to be self-sufficient in a world that offered no quarter. The silence between them remained, but it was a companionable silence now, woven through with unspoken understanding and a deep, abiding affection. The harsh edges of his grief had softened, not disappeared, but rounded by the constant, gentle presence of the child who had become his charge, his student, and in many ways, his rescuer. He still thought of Sarah and Eli, every day. But now, the memories were less a source of sharp, debilitating pain and more a quiet ache, a bittersweet reminder of love lost, but also of love's enduring power. Ilara, too, carried her own sorrows, but she carried them with a quiet dignity that belied her years. Sometimes, he would see her gazing at the distant mountains, her eyes filled with a wistful longing, and he knew she was thinking of her mother. He would say nothing, but simply place a comforting hand on her shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of her pain. One evening, as the first stars pricked the twilight sky, they sat on the small porch he had added to the cabin. Fang, older now and even more grey, lay at Caleb's feet, his head resting on his paws. Ilara was humming softly, mending one of Caleb's shirts by the fading light. "Caleb," she said, her voice thoughtful. Do you think Ma found peace?" He looked at her, at the earnest question in her young eyes. He considered his words carefully. "I believe," he said slowly, "that peace finds us all, in its own time, in its own way. And I believe she watches over you, like that star there." He pointed to the brightest star in the evening sky, steady and sure. Ilara smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up her face. "I think so too," she whispered. He had not offered her riches, or an easy life. He had offered her shelter, and a grudging, slowly blossoming care that had, against all odds, grown into a love as fierce and protective as any he had ever known. He had taken in a lost child, and in doing so, had found his own way back from the wilderness of his soul. They were a family, forged not by blood, but by shared hardship, by unspoken kindness, by the slow, patient healing of two broken hearts. The cabin was no longer just a shelter, it was a home. The fire in the hearth burned brightly, a testament to warmth, to life, to the enduring power of hope. And as you watch their story, perhaps you see a reflection of the wilderness within us all, the desolate places where loss resides, but also the unexpected trails that can lead us back to connection, to love, to the quiet strength of a found family. What storms have you weathered? What unexpected hand reached out, or what hand might you extend? The journey of healing is often walked with another. If their story of resilience and redemption touches your heart, consider subscribing. Join us as we continue to explore the landscapes of human emotion and the quiet courage it takes to build a new dawn from the ashes of yesterday.